I'm Comrade Shane, and this is a DPRK reality check. When it comes to the DPRK, one phrase which we are constantly hearing repeated in the mainstream media is human rights, followed by allegations of extreme abuses and crimes. In this episode, I would like to dispel the mainstream orthodox background assumptions about so-called human rights abuses in the DPRK, and also give you an idea of where and why these allegations exist and are so prevalent that they can float along those orthodox background assumptions without being seriously challenged. So perhaps some of you can challenge your own perceptions on the truth about human rights in the DPRK, while for others, this video may help you in your efforts to defend DPRK and even champion it as the socialist society it is. It's the DPRK's view that human rights are the rights of humanity to independence. In other words, to the rights of the masses as masters of state, society, and their own destiny, free from exploitation and oppression. As such, the genuine personification of human rights are the masses of the people. Guided by the Juche philosophy, it is fundamental to the world outlook of the DPRK that the masses of people demand the rights to live and develop independently and creatively, free from the fetters of nature and society, and also have the capability to achieve it. That all rights won by the masses in different eras are attributable to their demands for independence and their tireless efforts to realize it. The demand of the social collective for independence is a common demand of its members for the existence and development of their collective. And the demand of individual members for independence is the demand they can make as equal members of the collective, and they ought to be guaranteed by their collective. The demand of the masses, the social collective, represents the demand of the social community and coincides with the demand of individual members of the collective. That the human rights demanded and realized by the masses are genuine human rights that satisfy the demand of both the collective and its individual members. The West finds its origin of basic human rights of humanity in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen adopted in France on August 27, 1789, and the Declaration of Independence adopted in the U.S. on July 4, 1776. The former identifies the basic rights of humanity as, quote, liberty, property, safety, and resistance to oppression, end quote, while the latter identifies them as, quote, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, end quote. The DPRK views the basic rights of humanity as the most important rights, which serve as the source of all human rights. Without these basic rights, the realization of other rights is unthinkable. These basic rights are socio-political rights, the right to dignity, the right to existence, and the right to inviolability. Socio-political rights are the basis of all rights of humanity and enable them to occupy the position and perform the role as masters of state and society. If humanity fails to become master of politics, the masses of people cannot properly realize cultural or economic rights, so socio-political independence is most important for humanity. Socio-political independence is realized through the provision and exercise of the freedom and right to participate in achieving national sovereignty, state administration, and socio-political activities. The humanity-centered Juche philosophy considers humanity to be the most dignified and valuable being in the world. The dignity and value of humanity are realized properly when they exercise the rights to social and personal equality, to free development of individuality, and to treatment proper to a human being. Discrimination of personality, whatever the reason, is an insult to the dignity of humanity and enslavement of humanity. An application of inhuman and dishonorable morality. It constitutes an infringement upon the basic right to dignity. The right to existence is expressed in economic life. Only when a person has the right in economic life, whose contents are labor and ownership, and freely exercise it, can they maintain its existence and enjoy their life. Finally, unless the right to inviolability and freedom of the person is ensured, a person cannot exercise the rights whatsoever. Only when they are guaranteed the right to inviolability of the person, which is the right to not be detained or arrested without reason, can humanity exercise their rights to the full. It is the position of the DPRK that to set and apply human rights standards in conformity with the requirements of its people and its actual conditions, while respecting the human rights standards stipulated in international agreements on human rights, belongs to the sovereignty of every country. The system of provision of human rights in the DPRK began to be established after the country was liberated from Japanese imperialist colonial rule on August 15, 1945. Many countries which had formerly been colonies of imperialists maintained the laws of colonial days for a certain period, or instituted new laws by referring to them. However, just after its liberation from colonial rule, Korea proclaimed that all the laws and regulations which had been enforced under the colonial rule of Japanese imperialism had lost validity forever, and any legal order against the construction of a new society and the interests of the Korean people would not be tolerated. Korea has maintained the principle of completely abolishing draconian colonial laws and establishing a new legal system and order for ensuring people's freedom and rights as required by the building of a new society on the basis of the people's democratic and revolutionary consciousness of law. An important step in realizing human rights in the DPRK was the democratization of the judicial system. It was undertaken to thoroughly destroy the outdated judicial system which served the realization of Japanese colonial rule, and in its place build a people-oriented, revolutionary judicial system which would defend the rights and interests of the people. It began with the setting up of the Judiciary Bureau in November 1945. And after the establishment of the Provisional People's Committee of North Korea in February 1946, democratization of the judicial system was promoted and further advanced. So, the basis for a democratic judicial system that would provide rights and freedom for the people that is firmly in their own hands was laid in a short span of time after liberation. In Korea, the labor law was first proclaimed by a decision of the Provisional People's Committee of North Korea on June 24, 1946. As a result, the remnants of the Japanese imperialist colonial slave labor, which forced unlimited working hours, starvation wages, and harsh labor conditions, were completely liquidated, and the road to a new working life was open, with the enforcement of regular paid leave, Social Security, and other labor rights. The first constitution was adopted in September 1948 with the founding of the DPRK and comprehensively consolidated the democratic freedoms and rights which had already been gained by the people through individual laws and regulations. Declaring equal rights of citizens in all fields of social life, it first stipulates in the political field the right to elect and to be elected, the freedom of speech, the press, assembly, demonstration, and association, the rights to organize and join political parties, social and other organizations, and the freedom of religious belief and of holding religious ceremonies. It stipulated the rights of the working people in the sphere of economic life, the right to be awarded for the same return for the same work, the right to material assistance by Social Security scheme, and the right to run small and medium-sized trade and industry. In the field of social life, it stipulated the right to receive compulsory primary education and education at colleges and universities at state expense, the right to inviolability of the person, and the right to complaints and petitions. On the principles of internationalism, it prescribes the right of asylum and equal rights of citizens of ethnic minorities. The Socialist Constitution of the DPRK was adopted in December 1972 at the first session of the Fifth Supreme People's Assembly. It further consolidated the democratic rights and freedoms of the people. In relation to the fundamental rights of citizens, the Socialist Constitution first clarifies the principle of collectivism, on which the rights and duties of citizens are based. That the state substantially ensures all citizens the democratic rights, freedoms, and a happy material and cultural life. And that the rights and freedoms of citizens be further amplified with the consolidation and development of the socialist system. In the economic field, it stipulates the right of citizens such as the guaranteed right to work, relaxation, free medical care, education, freedom of scientific, literary, and artistic pursuits. It defines those to be put under special protection of state and society, and legal protection of overseas Koreans and foreign exiles. Then, an ordinance of the Supreme People's Assembly on completely eliminating taxation system was adopted on March 21, 1974. The decision and enactment of this ordinance was a historic event in the advancement of human rights in the DPRK, and made it the first country to completely emancipate its people from the burden of tax. The people-oriented constitution of the DPRK constitutes a firm legal guarantee, not only for speeding up the construction of a powerful socialist country, realizing the country's independent and peaceful reunification, and developing relations with other countries, but also for protecting and promoting the civil rights of the people. Chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 define the principles of state administration of the political, economic, cultural, and defense sectors, and set out matters of principle related with ensuring human rights, like policies, conditions, and measures. Some examples of articles in the Constitution for providing human rights in the political field includes Article 6. The organs of state power at all levels are elected on the principle of universal, equal, and direct suffrage by secret ballots. Article 8. As a people-centered system in which the working people are the masters of everything and everything in society serves them, the social system of the DPRK defends their interests and respects and protects their rights. Article 15. The DPRK shall champion the democratic, national rights of overseas Koreans and their legitimate right and interests recognized by international law. 17. The state shall promote unity with people all over the world who defend their independence and oppose all forms of aggression and interference. Article 18. The law of the DPRK reflects the wishes and interests of the working people and is a basic instrument for state administration. And Article 18. The law of the DPRK reflects the wishes and interests of the working people and is a basic instrument for state administration. Some examples of articles in the Constitution for providing human rights in the economic field includes Articles 21 and 22. The state shall define and protect the property of state and social cooperative organizations. Article 24. The state shall protect personal property and guarantee the right to inherit it by law. Article 25. The DPRK regards the steady improvement of the material and cultural life of the people as the supreme principle of its activities. The constantly increasing material wealth of society in the country is used entirely to promote the well-being of the working people. The state shall provide all working people with every condition for obtaining food, clothing, and housing. Article 27. The state shall free the working people from difficult and tiresome labor and narrow down the distinctions between physical and mental labor. Article 28. The state shall undertake, at its own expense, the building of production facilities for the cooperative farms and modern houses in the countryside. Article 29. The state renders the labor of the working people more joyful and worthwhile so that they willingly work with enthusiasm and creativity for society, the collective, and themselves. Article 31. The state shall prohibit the employment of children under the minimum working age. And Article 34. The state shall draw up and implement the plans for the development of the national economy in accordance with the laws of socialist economic development, so that the balance between accumulation and consumption can be maintained correctly, economic construction accelerated, and people's living standards steadily raised, and the nation's defense capability strengthened. Now, some examples of articles in the Constitution for providing human rights in the cultural field includes Article 40. The state shall make the whole society intellectual. Article 47. The state shall provide education to all pupils and students free of charge and grant scholarship to students of universities and colleges. That means all students. Article 53. The state shall provide sufficient modern cultural facilities so that all the working people may enjoy a socialist cultured aesthetic life to their heart's content. Article 56. The state shall protect people's lives and improve their health by consolidating and developing the system of universal, free medical service and improving the district doctor system and the system of preventative medicine. Article 57. The state shall adopt measures to prevent environmental pollution so as to provide the people with a hygienic living environment and working conditions. And in regards to the armed forces, Article 59 stipulates the mission of the armed forces of the DPRK. That is to defend and safeguard the interests of the working people, defend the socialist system and the gains of revolution from foreign aggression, and protect the freedom, independence, and peace of the country. Now I will review some articles on the fundamental rights of citizens as stipulated in the Constitution. Like the human rights we just discussed, they can be divided into political and civil rights, social, economic, and cultural rights. For political and civil rights, the Constitution stipulates the right to elect and to be elected, freedom of speech, the press, of assembly, of demonstration and association, freedom of religious belief. In fact, the Korean Federation of Buddhists, the Korean Federation of Christians, and other religious groups are a proud part of political parties and public institutions. The right to submit complaints and petitions, right to freedom of residence, right to inviolability of the person and home, and privacy of correspondence. For social, economic, and cultural rights, it stipulates the right to work. However, this is not comparable to right-to-work laws of capitalist countries, which empowers employers to treat employees as disposable. The right to work stipulated in the DPRK's Socialist Constitution is the guaranteed right to employment, which meets the desire, skill, and education of the person. The right to relaxation. The right to free medical care and social insurance. The right to education. The right to freedom of scientific, literary, and artistic pursuits. The characteristics of the fundamental rights of citizens stipulated in the Constitution are that, first, they are concrete rights which citizens possess and exercise in all domains of state and social life. Second, they are provided to every citizen equally and substantially. The Constitution stipulates specifically that the state shall effectively guarantee genuine democratic rights, freedom, as well as the material and cultural well-being of all its citizens, and defines that the rights and freedoms of citizens shall be amplified with the consolidation and development of the socialist system. Now, I don't want to leave this video at simply listing laws and articles related to human and citizen rights in the DPRK, but would like to give you a better understanding at how thoroughly and systematically these human rights are provided to the people with some brief examples. Provisions regarding the right to elect and to be elected include the fact that all citizens who have reached voting age exercise the right to elect and to be elected without any limitation, and all voters can participate in the elections on an equal footing and can be elected as deputy to a power organ. Voters elect the deputies to the people's assemblies at all levels with their own hands, according to their own will, and the secrecy of the result of balloting is ensured both during and after casting the ballot. Provisions for freedom of speech and press is materialized through more than 100 kinds of newspapers published at national, provincial levels, at factories, enterprises, universities, hundreds of periodicals printed by scores of publishing houses, and several TV and radio channels. All citizens freely exercise the freedom to express their view and opinions through publication, TV, and radio broadcasts. The right to free writing and creation of works is legally guaranteed, and the right to make proposals aimed at improving the work of state organs, enterprises, organizations, and public servants is ensured. The people are also provided with the right to obtain, process, and transfer information. As for the provision for freedom of thought and religion, everybody in the DPRK is fully provided with the right to choose and follow their thought and religion according to their free will. In accordance with the Constitution, people are free to choose and follow any religion, can officially or personally, privately or jointly hold religious service, ritual, and ceremony, provided it isn't used as a pretext to restrict the independence of others. They can also build religious structures or conduct religious education. In the DPRK, church and the state are clearly separated, and everybody is provided with freedom of religion. Through their everyday life and experience, and through historical processes, the Korean people have realized that the Juche idea is an idea that thoroughly defends and realizes their independence and truly guarantees human rights, and that when they advance along the road indicated by the idea, genuine happiness and prosperity will be achieved. They have acquired and follow this idea as an element of their faith and will on their own accord, contrary to the slander of imperialists, reactionaries, and their mouthpiece media. Provisions for the right to life in the DPRK is provided through protection of persons from arbitrary arrest and execution by state institutions, organizations, and individuals, as well as from diseases and natural disasters. In order to prevent damage from contagious diseases, the government has invested an enormous amount of funds in developing vaccines and importing necessary medicines, and takes positive steps to minimize the damage likely to be caused by natural disasters. The death penalty is imposed for the most serious crimes on an extremely limited basis. It is strictly prohibited to intentionally torture, that is, to inflict physical or mental pain upon humans and to treat and punish them in an inhumane and degrading manner. According to the criminal law, it is regarded as a crime to interrogate suspects in an inhumane manner by torture, exaggerated or fabricated cases, and deliver unjust judgments. In the DPRK, solitary confinement is also recognized as the heinous psychological torture that it is, and thus strictly prohibits it as a form of torture that is strictly illegal. The law of the DPRK on the composition of the court contributes to correctly trying and settling criminal and civil cases and guaranteeing the right of citizens to fair procedures in judgment by establishing a strict system and order in the composition of courts. Lawyers in the DPRK ensure the human rights of citizens and the legal system of the state through defense counseling and legal consultancy. And organs, enterprises, organizations, and citizens have the right to select lawyers freely for legal proceedings and legal acts. The provision of the right to education is provided by the DPRK through free education, and all educational institutions are strictly prohibited from charging parents or guardians of children with fees for admission, lesson, study tour, internship, or field trips. The state gives special attention to staffing educational institutions, building up the ranks of teachers, improving the methods of education, and providing educational conditions. The provision of the right to health is realized in the DPRK through the complete and universal free medical service and preventative medical care system. All kinds of medical service, medication, diagnosis, experimental test, treatment, operation, doctor's visits, hospitalization, prescriptions, and meals are provided free of charge. It is a state policy in the DPRK to treat the elderly with respect and look after their life and health in a responsible manner. The elderly receive regular pension and allowances of various forms from the state. Even if they have their supporters, they may receive state support according to their wish. The state provides persons with disabilities with more favorable conditions and environment in medical treatment, education, cultural activities, labor, and respects their personalities, including the right to choose employment of their choice or to choose employment in an occupation specially designed for persons with disabilities. And perhaps the most surprising of all for those who have only heard the imperialist slander about human rights in the DPRK is the provisions to realize the right to adequate standard of living. The DPRK applies such a new revolutionary form of remuneration as additional benefits by state and society, together with the reward for work done, thus ensuring the right of the people to adequate standard of living. Everyone in the country, from birth, has the right to food and is supplied with food grain prices at next to nothing. The state supplies food to workers, office employees, and even newly born babies. And as an example of what I mean by food grain prices at next to nothing, the state purchases rice at the price of 189 won per kg and corn at 96 won per kg from cooperative farms, and then sells rice at 46 won and corn processed noodles at 33 won. So through the miracle of a planned economy, it is able to buy the raw grain from the farmers at a higher cost than it sells the processed foodstuff back to them. And so we can also say that the DPRK ensures the human right of the complete fruits of one's labor. And another provision for the realization of the right to adequate standard of living is that the state builds and allots housing free of charge, and the people experience no form of dwelling tax. It builds and allots dwelling houses for all the working people and bears most of the utility cost. What is charged for this is based on the income, called living expense, the person receives. Meanwhile, farmers are excluded altogether from any utility cost, and thus receive housing at entirely no charge to them. In the DPRK, there are many state organs and organizations concerned with the protection and promotion of human rights. State organs are the Supreme People's Assembly, the State Affairs Commission, the Presidium of the Supreme People's Assembly, the Cabinet, Commissions and Ministries, local People's Assemblies and People's Committees, public prosecutors' offices, and courts. If you'd like to learn more about these organs in general, check out the video on the channel called DPRK Reality Check, Politics and State Organs, which I'll leave a link to in the description. Some public organizations with this mission in the DPRK are the Kim Il-sungist Kim Jong-ilist Youth League, the Socialist Women's Union of Korea, General Federation of Trade Unions of Korea, the Union of Agricultural Workers of Korea, Korea Federation for the Protection of Persons with Disabilities, Korea Federation for the Care of the Aged, Korea Society for Human Rights Studies, Korea Education Fund, Korea Committee on Measure for the Victims of Sexual Slavery of the Japanese Army and Forcible Drafting, the Red Cross Society of Korea, the Bar Association of Korea, the Democratic Lawyers Association of Korea, the Family Planning and Maternity and Child Health Association of Korea, and many, many more. And some organs for international cooperation in the field of human rights to be found in DPRK include, but are not limited to, the National Coordinating Committee for the Implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, National Committee for UNESCO, the National Committee for UN Food and Agricultural Organization, and the National Coordinating Committee for the Implementation of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And so here we see that, contrary to the orthodox mainstream narrative, the DPRK is not against international human rights organizations. In fact, it is the position of the DPRK that international human rights organizations should enhance their roles to address the issue of human rights at the international level. That enhancing the role of the UN General Assembly is of utmost importance. That these international bodies, in particular the UN Human Rights Council, should never be abused as a tool serving the interests of certain countries. And the human rights situation in each country should be assessed in an objective and impartial manner. Thus, DPRK recognizes that no nation should allow a violation of sovereignty by outside forces in the interpretation and application of international human rights instruments. The interventionist and aggressive maneuvers of the US and other imperialist countries, using the pretext of human rights protection and under the signboard of the UN General Assembly, should never be tolerated, because such interventions and interference in the sovereignty of others has been clearly shown by history to grant no one better human rights, and in every case has made the situation worse. The DPRK attaches due attention to the cooperation and exchanges with international organizations and countries in the field of guaranteeing human rights. It provided convenience to the members of the Amnesty International, International Association Against Torture, UN Commission on the Rights of the Child, Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women of the then UN Commission on Human Rights. It arranged for them to meet law enforcement officials and persons at reform institutions, and to visit reform institutions and detention rooms, so as to help them inquire into the actual human rights situation in the country. It has responded with good faith and tolerance to the questions raised by the UN High Commission for Human Rights, human rights conventions implementing bodies, and other organizations under the UN and non-governmental human rights bodies. The major obstacle to the protection and promotion of human rights in the DPRK are the hostile policies pursued by the US and other Western countries that follow their lead. They are moves and policies to stamp out the country politically, blackmail it militarily, and isolate and stifle it economically. This is out of its ambition to occupy and control the whole Korean peninsula, just as the US has maintained an unpopular division of Korea and militarily occupied the southern half of the nation since the Korean War. Owing to the hostile moves of the US that regards the Korean people and the DPRK as its enemy, the right of the Korean people to peace and development has been threatened continuously. The Korean War, which the US unleashed on Korea, lasted 3 years, and most recent estimates show that it claimed the lives of around 8 million, about 30% of the population in North Korea. Every building over 2 stories in Pyongyang and at least 75% of the entire city was turned to rubble by the bombing campaigns. This war of invasion, along with the refusal to sign a peace treaty, the incessant military provocations including war games, the continued occupation of the nation, and the moves of the U.S. to ignite a new war all constitute crimes against the right of the Korean people to live and develop in a peaceful and free environment. Since the end of the Korean War, the U.S. has imposed sanctions, embargoes, and blockade on the DPRK. These have been unprecedented in their viciousness and tenacity. And these moves are aimed at isolating, stifling, causing insecurity including starvation, and destabilizing the DPRK in order to overthrow its socialist system, which rejects U.S. imperialist hegemony. These moves by the U.S., its allies, and vassal states are also crimes against human rights and humanity, which check the sovereign state's rights to develop and exert a great negative impact on the people's ability to enjoy their rights. These sanctions are a crime as serious as wartime genocide, which, as I just pointed out, the U.S. has also rained on Korea. As it has learned that military threats and even isolating sanctions are helpless in bringing down the socialist system of the DPRK and bringing all of Korea, its labor and resources under its thumb, the U.S. is trying to internationalize the anti-DPRK human rights smear campaign by instigating its followers and vassals. Its smear campaign, like all other hostile moves against the DPRK, is aimed at ignoring the reality and political mode and social system in the DPRK and changing them at any cost. To strengthen its hegemony and its position as the leading imperialist power. These acts by the U.S. also represent an attempt to destroy the very foundation of international human rights mechanisms and turn them into an instrument of unilateral political power to be wielded by the U.S. against countries it deems enemies. And for the empire, any country that refuses to be its vassal risks becoming its enemy. So now you might be asking, why does the free and independent media of the US and other capitalist countries simply repeat the slander by US capitalists and imperialists? Well, it's because there is no such thing as a free and independent media in a capitalist country. Because in these capitalist countries, the media is not simply friendly to transnational corporate system that has an interest in the existence of imperialism. The media itself are part of the corporate capitalist class, which feeds itself to bloated proportions from the existence of the imperialist extraction of super profits. A threat to the bourgeoisie, imperialists, and imperialism itself is exactly a threat to the existence of the private, corporate, for-profit media as it exists in capitalist countries today. This is why I call it the imperialist mainstream mouthpiece and nothing more. This is also why if you take any slanderous article on the subject of DPRK, you will find that there are usually no sources of information provided and no concrete evidence of accusations given. Often the mainstream media, or media in occupied Korea, will report people executed or killed as evidence of human rights abuses, only to have them reappear on TV or newspapers in the DPRK, forcing the mainstream media to correct their previous reporting on execution. Mind you, usually with a much shorter, much smaller article found towards the back of the publication or the tail end of a broadcast. Instead of reality or evidence, in order to strengthen the effectiveness of slander against the DPRK, the US employs a strategy of utilizing defector testimony. The goal, as with their slander in general, exists for the purpose of strengthening support for immoral sanctions, interventions, and starting a new war of invasion. Thus, it has created an industry for finding so-called defectors, including such strategies for finding defectors as deceit, smuggling out wanted and violent criminals, and even straight-up human trafficking and kidnapping. Ensuring they say things that support the US slander using methods such as keeping people imprisoned in solitary confinement upon their arrival in occupied Korea until they are willing to keep quiet about any positive remarks or activities to support the DPRK, which by the way is against law in South Korea and can have you jailed. These laws are very vague, leaving them very open to interpretation, which is the point of them. And they also must vow never to attempt to return, which is made very hard anyway, as former residents of DPRK, if they end up in South Korea, generally they will never gain a passport again to go anywhere. While those willing to spin wild stories of heinous abuses of human rights and horrific conditions can earn enormous amounts of money being paraded by US handlers in front of the media. None of this has anything to do with giving an objective view or revealing the truth about the DPRK. It is an industry which exists for the sole purpose of strengthening the slander of the US against the DPRK, while obscuring the evidence and reality demonstrating the contrary. If you'd like to understand this criminal industry of defector testimony about the DPRK, I highly recommend checking out the video Loyal Citizens of Pyongyang and Seoul, which is available on YouTube. It goes into much more detail about this topic, and I will leave a link to it in the description of this video. Despite the hostile moves, unrelenting pressure, and aggression of the US and its followers to overthrow, dominate, isolate, and stifle the DPRK, the government of the Republic continuously advances policies for the promotion and protection of human rights, and is making every effort to bring them into effect. Thanks to the steadfast, people-oriented policies advanced by the government, and its continued efforts to perfect human rights instruments, legislation, and policies, ever-amplifying human rights will be guaranteed in the DPRK. That's all for this episode. I hope that gives you a better understanding of human rights in the DPRK and allows you a more firm position in defending it from reactionary slander and lies. If you enjoyed what you saw, subscribe to my channel to keep up with my videos. Also, please consider liking and sharing this video so we can spread the truth about the DPRK and march together towards an independent, democratic, peaceful new world. Song and salute, comrades.